Valheim is much like its predecessors in the sense that it is a procedurally generated survival game with its own quirks. Namely, Valheim is set in a Norse mythos fantasy land much like Skyrim, but closer to Minecraft in the sense that players can build anything provided their imagination allows it, and craft tools to help achieve that goal along the way. In addition to that, the Norse setting affects everything from the environment to the atmosphere and enemies. Ultimately, this influences the way the player encounters play out significantly. If one wants to play as a Nordic hunter constantly in the search of fowl for spoils, they can, but will seldom find enjoyment in progressing further because the game forces the player to progress every few days with events that just spawn hordes of enemies other than the boars they may have become quite acquainted with by the time they unleash their wrath. However, that is not to say that it affects aspects of the game other than role-playing, because it seldom does give the player the option to do so. If gathering resources for housing and other contraptions is the goal of a playthrough, then one can be satisfied with their results up until a certain point. From gathering wood from trees and an act of felling one that echoes throughout a forest, to gathering copper from ore deposits elsewhere and gathering natural crops to unnaturally cultivate elsewhere, there is plenty to discover about the way the game utilizes item gathering to affect both the building and crafting process. Speaking of building, physics affect it too. Namely, if you want to make a house, you'll need to make sure smoke isn't encompassing your interior every time you make a home. Not only that, but it affects the way other things work too, to a point that it becomes what I consider a hindrance. Because although this game is rooted in an unnaturally mythic environment, it utilizes physics quite a lot more than you'd expect. However, unfortunately, these changes from the traditional survival experiences found in games like Terraria that are more unique to this game have negatively affected the way it plays, especially in terms of progression. That go anywhere and do anything design philosophy from other games like it is missing here, because progression is tied to different biomes. What I mean is that you are going to have a really hard time in, say, the plains if you haven't already gone to the swamp and gotten past the Bronze Age. Even that is a challenge, because there is a huge difficulty spike from the Black Forest to the swamp that ultimately inhibits the progression and makes the game more of a chore than fun to play. With difficulty spikes comes many a deaths and frustrations to the point where the player considers uninstalling your game and moving on with their finite time. That is to say that at the Copper Age, progression comes to a very long and egregious halt. At this stage, the developers intend for you to go to the swamp and find a wishbone. However, as mentioned previously, this game is procedurally generated, and as such, so are the spawn locations of such items. Normally that wouldn't be a problem. However, here, for whatever reason, the developers decided to make the enemies more than twice as difficult as enemies in the Black Forest. The previous biome the player has been to at this stage, because there is almost no way to get to the swamp otherwise, unless you get lucky with world generation. So naturally this makes it a trek to get to because it's not anywhere near spawn and requires a boat to travel to, and even more frustrating when you die and lose your boat there. On top of dropping your valuable stuff you spent countless hours gathering prior to the trip there. Portals could very well circumvent my frustrations with this, if it weren't for the fact that they rely too heavily on physics to the point it becomes rage-inducing. You see, if you use a portal or fast travel system, whether lore accurate or not, in any other game, you carry all your items with you. However, for whatever reason, the developers decided that if you have any sort of ore on your person, that you absolutely need to transport it via ship travel instead of your portal right by you. So naturally that makes armor progression and ore gathering more of a chore than it needs to be. That's not even mentioning it restricts more basic mechanics, like fishing, behind this progression. Sure, you could argue that the game was going for a Souls-like experience, grounded in realism in some cases, but that isn't what the game sets up and promises to deliver on in the first few hours of gameplay. There are no real difficulty options to speak of unless you go out of your way to change world modifiers before you start the game, which the game never notifies you that you can do. Ultimately, other games have balancing figured out for normal playthroughs without increasing difficulty so much that you can't recover from minor damages. On top of that, the procedural generation could be executed better in general. That is to say that when the content in a biome is too little to justify the scope of it, there's little reason to make it huge and expansive beyond artificially expanding playtime and thus making it more difficult to navigate in the process. For instance, Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall is unconceivably expansive for its time. However, it suffers from this for this very reason. All of its quests are procedurally generated, save for the main one, which effectively makes it a fetch quest simulator that ultimately doesn't do anything interesting beyond that despite its gargantuan scale. Although it gets made fun of a lot for it, because mod developers for the game put out content much faster, Minecraft is scaling down figured out. That is, when they make a huge content update, they don't just add a pig that isn't already present in the mushroom biome or something like that, and instead add or change enough content in, say, the Nether to justify a massive content update, or fundamentally change the way combat works alongside an update to the end dimension and not just the combat itself. Ultimately, Valheim fails to deliver on fundamental parts of the game that its predecessors have figured out. Progression can keep players engaged, and when it doesn't flow well with the rest of the game, it makes players less likely to continue playing. I'm optimistic it can be fixed in the future updates though, because the game is still in early access despite having been out for a few years now. Regardless of how I feel about the game though, smaller, more condensed experiences optimized for engaging play will suffice when the scope is too big to justify the means of achieving it, because to me, bigger and more challenging does not always mean better.